All right. So thanks everyone for joining. So I'm going to talk about FCIs, and I guess it always surprises me as to the topic of FCIs, why it's a surprise to so many people, because it shouldn't be. Because I think it's a really important metric that all of us should be caring about. If you're not familiar with FCIs, it stands for failed customer interactions. And I actually think it's a much better way, or maybe an additional way, depending on your point of view, of thinking about the real availability of a system from a customer-centric viewpoint rather than just availability. So I'm going to explain what FCI is and how to measure it, and go into the depth and how actually, for me, having Sedai in the mix has been really helpful in understanding FCIs. But before we do that, if you can go to the next slide, we need to understand what engineering excellence and operational excellence is. So I won't repeat all the words on here, but think about, if you are running a SaaS company, the backbone of any SaaS company is operational and engineering excellence. So what is engineering excellence? It's basically all the work you need to create and deploy your software into production. There's a lot of things that happen. You have to write the code, you've got designs, you've got the experience piece of it, you have the product market fit piece of it, and then you have to run it through a CI/CD pipeline. All this stuff is part of engineering excellence. And then there is operational excellence, which is what happens to your software in production. What do you have to do in order to maintain it, in order to keep it running well, in order to improve the customer experience, all the work that happens after deployment takes place. And next slide, there are a few metrics which track engineering excellence and operational excellence. So escapes to production, code coverage, defects out of SLA, the release velocity, all these things are very often part of engineering excellence. You as leaders might have a few other metrics you'd throw, but these are the kinds of things that you care about as far as engineering excellence is concerned. And in operational excellence, you have to think about performance. We had Prakash, I think, give a fantastic perspective on performance, which I completely agree with. And I've also written in great detail about the importance of performance on my blog. Availability, we're going to talk a little bit FCI, cost management, which is another place where actually Sedai can help a bunch. But for this particular slide presentation on the next slide, we are just going to focus on two things, which is availability and the failed customer interaction. Can you flip, please? Oh, sorry, the previous slide. Yeah, so we're just going to look at just availability and the failed customer interaction piece of it. So let's start out by thinking about availability a little bit. Long-standing metric on the next slide. There is a little definition of what availability looks like, where really well understood. The total time minus impacted time divided by the total time, right? So you're really subtracting out impacted time. But if you think about it, this is a metric that is really old, and it was really built for a time when monoliths really rule the roost, where you're thinking in terms of there is a machine somewhere, and there is a Ethernet cable coming into that, and either the network is down or the machine is down, and that's your availability, right? So if you go to the next slide, you will see that it's a measure that was more suited for monoliths, because and really it's thinking about the back-end system. It's really thinking in terms of, is my machine up and is the software serving customers or not? You're not really thinking about the customer experience at all. And for any great product, for any great business, you got to think about the customer experience. And that's actually a much more important metric for you to be tracking. And if you think about how modern systems have evolved, on the next slide, I've given a little bit of a perspective on how monolith decomposition has taken place. So on the x-axis, you've got read replicas. That's one of the ways in which you actually distribute load by having read concurrency. On the y-axis, you have the whole notion of microservices. So that's how you build scalable teams by actually separating out functionality into multiple services. And on the z-axis, you have things like swim lanes, which are the way you scale resiliency in systems. So there are all these things that happen, but and the notion of availability is actually kind of hard to apply when your system is actually changed from this single dot to more of a cube kind of thing where all these things are happening in a system. What happens if a particular microservice is down, which means a particular function in the system is not working? How do you calculate availability for that? Or if, let's say that you've got all your US customers in one swim lane and your Canadian customers in a different swim lane. Well, let's assume that this Canadian cluster has gone down. How do you measure availability? I think it gets really, really dicey about how you actually think about that, which is why I think a much better modern way of thinking about it is, rather than thinking in terms of time, thinking about things in terms of count. And that's what FCI, failed customer interaction, really is. If you go to the next slide, John, um, you know, so I've spoken to some of this. It's not proportional to the severity of the incident. It does not measure the customer experience. It's not tangible or clearly owned. That is, an SRE might be assigned, oh, this availability incident happened, you need to do a root cause analysis. But at the end of the day, the changes have to be implemented by some Scrum team somewhere, and it's not clear where the ownership of that lies. And finally, I'll just say, I'm not going to go too deep into this, but there's this notion of task completion rate, which is, I think, really important for us to be thinking about, which is a customer has landed on your web page and they're trying to finish a certain task. Have they been able to do it, and have they been able to do it easily? Well, availability doesn't measure any of that, right? So if you go to the next slide, instead, I think we need to be thinking about a more customer-centric metric. Something that will measure and improve the customer experience, improve team ownership, improve NPS scores, because you're actually measuring and looking at customers' happiness. And that's something that is easily measurable, right? And actually, such a metric actually exists. It's just not used as much as it needs to be used in the industry. And if you go to the next slide, I actually define this is what a failed customer interaction is. It's very simple. What are the total number of failed customer interactions? And I'll tell you what I mean by that, divided by the total number of interactions. There is no notion of time in this. You can add on, layer on time on top of this and say, in a given period, how many such incidents happened. But it's a count-based measure as opposed to a time-based measure. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So what is an FCI? These are FCIs. Anytime you get a 500 error, you get often a 404 errors. Those are actually failed customer interactions. And I bet all of you have seen it. Even I've experienced it with Google, I've experienced it with Amazon. Suresh asked me to throw in Bank of America. I think he has a particular dislike of Bank of America, I think. So I found a snapshot of Bank of America. FCIs happen all the time. And it doesn't matter, what system you build. If you've got any number of users, someone is going to do something which will cause a failed customer interaction, which causes an internal server error. I was kind of shocked 2 weeks back. I was at chase.com, looking at my credit card bills. I got an unmanaged Apache error, 500 error. It was not even caught. It's like kind of impressive that a company like Chase would have that. But anyway, the point is, software is complex, problems happen. Anytime there is a 500 error that happens in the system, if you backtrack it all the way to the browser, there's a customer who's kind of pissed off at what you have done because they were unable to finish what they were trying to do. And our job as engineering leaders is actually to be looking at those errors, understanding the frustration the customers have, and actually fixing this problem of these 500 errors, and actually ensuring that you have the least number of 500 errors in the system. So that's what the FCI metric is all about. Next slide, please. Here's the thing. Here's the secret that everyone should know. It should be plastered on a billboard on 101. Your observability platform can measure FCIs for you very, very easily. It's actually doing it right now. We're just not looking at it. So at GoodHire or Inflection, we were using Datadog, and it was literally minutes for us to set up a dashboard to tell us what our failed customer interaction rate is. And There aren't too many benchmarks that you can find around this. The only one I've been able to find is actually from talking to colleagues and friends at AWS, where AWS says our benchmark for failed customer interactions is less than 0.025% of total transactions in the system. So by way of context, that means that if you've got 1 million transactions, Amazon says that there should be less than 250 of them should have failed, right? Next slide, please. So this is the case study from the company where I was. When we started out, we were at 3.2%. And let me just say, based on my experience with having looked at systems, unless you're actually looking at these numbers and fixing it, 3.2% is actually pretty damn good to start out with. From there, we actually made it part of our quarterly plan to bring this down. Our goal was to get it to 0.025%. We actually got it to 0.02%. It took us actually close to 3 quarters to accomplish this. And then the team went actually above and beyond to a point where essentially FCIs were undetectable in our system. Now, what is the value of doing all this? The value is in the NPS scores. Now, I can't 100% call out causation over here, but we went from 63 to 68 to 70 on the NPS score of the product. Of course, there were other things that were also happening which also moved the needle, but this is consistent with the expectation I have. When customers are able to do their job, and they're able to use the system well, and the system is performing well, you know what? Your NPS score is going to go up. Next slide, please. So how do you actually implement FCIs? A big part of it was, you've already kind of put a label of, yeah, that's this Lambda guy, somewhere, a sticker somewhere on my forehead. A big part of it was actually moving to Lambda. And the value in moving to Lambda was we were easily able to deploy Sedai on top of it. And we are actually, honestly, SREs stopped paying attention to our Lambdas after a certain point. Now, 500 errors can be caused by multiple things. There could be scaling kinds of errors where you don't have the right number of resources, and so requests are getting dropped. Or timers are running. Unfortunately, we are running .NET and C#, and of all the stacks on Lambda, C# has actually the worst latencies, the worst issues with cold starts. We are often seeing in excess of 15 seconds, and what customer is going to hang around for 15 seconds? That's a big problem. But actually using some of the autonomous management, we are actually able to make significant headway into that. The second thing I would say is, really around the second and last point actually are around mindset. And really, you got to make it a priority to be saying that, solving for customers is what we do. And part of solving for customers, one of the goals you have to set for yourself is to say, we are going to burn down the FCI errors. And we actually did that. And there's a little write-up I have in CIO.com on how to bridge the customer engineer gap if you're interested. And there are other things like, we had an on-call program. And what does an on-call program help me accomplish? So the idea of an on-call program is engineers do not take, their backlog items and start working on them for the duration of a week when they're on call. Instead, their job is to work with customer success, for example, and really understand what customers are calling in for, to look at Datadog logs or whatever, Splunk logs or whatever you use to understand what kind of 500 errors are happening, to look at the dashboards over there and actually fix that. And that was the job that they had. Next slide, please. The last thing I would say is this is how we used actually Sedai. So first of all, it was fully autonomous. We didn't actually have access to the work, the incredible work that has been done with the Lambda extensions. I wish we had that and actually reduced cold starts even further. We can, cold start were a little bit of an issue, and we found other ways of dealing with it using reserved concurrency. Provision concurrency, not reserved concurrency. And with the fully autonomous management, I would honestly say that 500 errors, which can be caused either by coding errors, like I said, or by really scaling issues. The scaling issues kind of thing went away. So almost all the errors we are having were really because of coding kinds of issues where someone had not thought through all the code paths, and that's what we are really able to focus on. What that meant was we actually didn't have SREs. We had two SREs, but their job was to take care of the stuff which was still in the monolith, which hadn't been moved over to serverless. No one was paying attention to serverless, and maybe that's good or bad. Once a week is all we used to look at. What the heck has Sedai done, and go and look at the dashboards. And both vertical and horizontal scaling was being done. And the release intelligent metrics were interesting. Every now and then, Sedai would tell us, hey, something screwy going on with this release, and we would go in and say, okay, should we even be deploying it or not? I would say that my approximation is about a 90% improvement on the serverless side of things, on things I would call busy work. And this was concomitant with us moving away from Kubernetes and moving on to serverless. So that's a little bit about what FCIs are all about. I think autonomous, irrespective whether you're a Kubernetes fan or you're doing on servers, I think autonomous is the way things are going. But you got to pay attention to fail customer interaction, irrespective of what path you've taken, because I think it can hugely improve the customer experience. So, John, do we have time? I think that's my last slide. I'm happy to take questions if anyone has questions.
One or two questions would be good.
Okay.
The first one, could you give a sense of, in terms of FCIs, like what level of kind of aggregation do you kind of define it as, in terms of how broad a step of the customer experience would you carve out to be a single?
Yeah, so good question. So how are FCIs carved up? So each microservice, each Scrum team owned a number of assets, which are generally microservices. And so Scrum teams owned the FCI count for the services that they owned. So each Scrum team had their own dashboard, right, which said, hey, for this microservice, here's how many FCIs you've had in this past week. For this one, how many have you had? And then manager or the tech lead or the team would decide, based on everything else they have going on, what their plan is for the next iteration about which ones they're going to focus on, or if they're going to focus on it and burn it down or not. As a leader, what the instructions I said was, these are our quarterly goals. Our goal is to get to whatever 0.02% FCIs, or well, a smaller quantum probably, 0.04% FCIs, let's say. And everyone's goal is to get to that. Sometimes leaders would come in and negotiate and say, can't get there, here's what I can do because of all the backlog. There was always back and forth. But yeah, that's how we managed it. I thought, I personally think Datadog is a phenomenal tool. It really helped us manage these things really well.
Great. And last question was, you mentioned there was a 90% reduction in the busy work. How did that saving get reinvested? What were people doing instead?
So the first thing I would say is, we had some folks who were complete Kubernetes. So actually, let me backtrack. The question that was posed was, how did you reinvest the money that was saved by this 90% that you mentioned? So some of our Kubernetes specialists actually left. I think that was right for them, and it was right for the company. We actually helped them find jobs anywhere. It's not like Kubernetes skills are, will land you in trouble. There's a big need for the industry. It just wasn't right for us. And we actually ended up not backfilling those roles because we didn't actually need it. But instead, we hired some more engineers on the team because, I'm a firm believer in, quality is owned by Scrum teams, and you can't delegate it out to an operations team or to a SRE team. So we actually, took those open positions and hired some more dev engineers for Scrum teams with that. Yeah.
Okay, so more of the operations is embedded in the...
That is correct. Operations, I think that's the right model if you're in the cloud. Operations, even things like cost management were actually the responsibility of the Scrum team. Cool. Thank you all very much. I hope that was helpful.